Hello, hello, everybody, and welcome to another fantastic episode of Truth Wanted. I'm your host, ObjectivelyDan, and this is the live call-in show where we talk to people about what they believe and why. Live Fridays at 7 p.m. Central every single week, and every single week I have a very special guest with me. This week is no different. It is Dr. Josh of Digital Hammurabi. Dr. Josh, what's going on?
Not too much. Thanks for having me on.
Yes. So if you're not familiar with Dr. Josh, he is a cool guy. He has a PhD in Assyriology and is one of two members of the Digital Hammurabi channel, where you talk about the Bible, ancient history, Syrian languages, and that related stuff that they pay you the big bucks for, not me. So I'm excited to hear you talk about that tonight. Thanks for being on.
Yeah. I appreciate that. Yeah, it should be a good time. We have a lot of fun with it. So
for sure. So I wanted to start off this conversation in particular, talking about the good book, Dr. Josh. I think you've heard of it. I think you've read it once or
couple
twice.
times.
Couple times. Yeah. The Bible, right? The Bible. It's a big book, but it's a book that you have spent part of your scholarship and your academic career kind of looking at very seriously. And I think a lot of people are surprised. I know we were talking about this before the show. When I was a kid, I had no idea that even the concept of like biblical studies as like an academic discipline was a thing. And not only is it a thing, but they have a lot to say about the Bible and its claims. And that's something that you talk about a bit on your channel as well. So I wanted you to maybe talk about like, what's your relationship been like with the Bible, as someone who grew up in the church and then also kind of now looks at it in an academic fashion.
Yeah. So I guess we can go as deep with that as you'd like. I mean, I grew up as a fundamentalist evangelical Christian. We went to a Baptist church as far back as I can remember. I was saved when I was 5 or 6 years old. And, I wanted to be a missionary when I was, when I was that age, and probably up until I was about 10 or 12. But then I kind of grew up and wanted to become a pastor, like what you're supposed to do. So,
Right. Sure.
But yeah, we were, in church 3 times a week plus. And when I graduated high school, I joined the Air Force and immediately, started diving into my bachelor's degree from Liberty University, which, people know what Liberty University is. That tells you something about my background. So that's where I got my bachelor's degree in religion. And then I got commissioned as a second lieutenant to become a chaplain in the Air Force. And I started going to seminary. And I went to a very evangelical school, conservative evangelical school called Capital Bible Seminary in just outside of DC. And I got my master's of theology there. And so, up to that point, I was obviously, I pastored a church for 7 years out in Virginia. And, so Christianity, fundamentalist evangelical Christianity was who I was to my core.
Right.
And I got into Johns Hopkins University to become an Assyriologist, which is essentially just, for somebody that specialized in the Old Testament, it was my way of getting an even broader look at the wider ancient Near East. So, you learn languages like Akkadian, Sumerian, Aramaic, and the cultures of ancient Iraq, which, always, came into contact with in a variety of ways with the Southern Levant, with Palestine. And my first year there, I became an atheist.
Wow, that's all it took. 1 year,
yeah.
huh?
And it was probably about halfway through my first year. And it was just, having to read the ancient literature and not, this was the big problem for me anyway, because I have friends that are evangelicals that went through Hopkins with me. One of my best friends is, fills that fits that category. And the thing is, when he was challenged with sort of these academic problems, these historical, archaeological, literary problems with the Hebrew Bible, with the Bible in general. He was in a setting where it was controlled. I would say it was safe, because he was also in an evangelical school, but it was a very academically minded one.
Sure.
And so, it was, this sounds bad, but here's how it makes sense. Whereas with me, it was just, well, here's the data. I mean, it wasn't even about the Bible. It was just, look, here's history of the ancient Near East. Here's history of Palestine. Here's the literary text that, it was like, wait a minute, this is all incredibly problematic. So, I after about a year and a half, maybe, of being a kind of a hard atheist, I kind of slipped back in, probably for no other reason than it was easier for me to, like, a soft agnosticism. But, more recently, maybe the past couple of years, somebody said, Josh, talking to you, I think you're an atheist. I think it's probably better to call you an atheist than an
comes
agnostic.
out a little bit. Yeah.
So,
I mean, like, when you know what you know, I imagine that's pretty difficult, because I kind of came to a similar thing with my own kind of deconstruction, where it was like, oh, I'm reading all this apologetic stuff, I'm reading what critics have to say, and it got to a point where it's like, suddenly my relationship with Christianity I couldn't relate it to the Christians around me anymore, because they believe in something totally different than what I did. Even as when I was going through this kind of progressive Christian stage in my Christianity, it was like, even this is like, it's too much. And it's like, it doesn't fit in with the people around me. And even the other people that I agree with, like, I still disagree with them on other stuff. Like, it didn't even make sense. So I can imagine, as someone in your field who, grew up evangelical, who did all the right things that you're supposed to do, and then having it not match up, I can imagine that's probably pretty difficult.
Yeah, I mean, I think the one thing that I see, particularly here online, that I can that resonates with me is, if you start off with your conclusion, right? You've had this personal experience with Jesus Christ, and deep down the Bible is the Word of God, and therefore it's inerrant and inspired.
Yeah.
Any problems that you face with that, it's very difficult to overcome that core belief, right? And so, you can say to somebody, hey, look, there are conflicting accounts here in the Joseph story of Genesis 37, or hey, this, look at there seem to be two different flood stories in Genesis 6 through 9, or how do you, look, there are problems with the creation story that's in Genesis 1 and the other one that's in Genesis 2.
Yeah.
But if you're talking to somebody that has this core belief that the Bible is inspired, I liken it to the show Monk. If you've ever seen that television show Monk, about the brilliant detective, every episode starts off with this impossible murder that took place, and that person did it, but there's no way that he could have done it. But you trust Monk, right? From watching the show that he's right, and at the end of the show he's going to be right, and so you go with it, and whatever possible scenario, contrived thing that comes out, he jumped out of an airplane and parachuted down, and then was able to tunnel underground back into his jail cell just in time for the people to see him. Like, that all, it's possible. And so that must be what it was.
Right.
And that's how it is. For me at Hopkins, it took so much before it was like, God, is this really the inspired text? Because for goodness sake, like, it's just one wave after another of problems. And once that happened, it just allowed for what makes more sense here.
Right. When you realize that the text is just written by a bunch of humans, just like you and me, and there doesn't seem to be, in my opinion, any evidence of divine inspiration, then suddenly the book's, it's not as powerful as it was. I mean, like, why revolve your life around this thing if it's just as good as anybody else's take on the world? And in fact, it's not as good as everybody else's take on the world, because, and you know this for a fact, that there are claims made in that book that don't match up with what we observe in reality, at least in terms of archaeology, but also in terms of life, and in terms of just, other kinds of stuff too. So Yeah, that's really interesting. And you brought up some interesting points too, where it's like I didn't even realize there were like two different flood accounts in the Bible until I was like really doing deep dives and doing my deconstruction. I didn't realize there were like two separate, really Genesis stories. But like, I guess you kind of, I'm used to like Sunday school accounts of what you see in the text. You read a little bit of the passage. Maybe you're on a youth retreat and you just read a little bit, and that's it. That's your daily dose of the Bible. Or maybe you have some sort of daily verse calendar thing that you go through. I had one or two of those. But when you read it, when you decide to sit down and just look through it, and then you look up like the academic commentary, you just get a very, very, very different picture than what you're usually taught at church. And there's a lot of questions that come up that don't always have satisfying answers, at least in my experience. So
and there's it's a little sad to me, actually. I put a chapter in this new book that's coming out about the contradictions in the Pentateuch, because it's the chapter is called "Did Moses Write the Pentateuch?" And I look at the first two chapters of Genesis, and there's significant problems, right? Very significant problems. And one of them that comes up is, for example, outside of things like, was man created at the end of creation, or was he created at the beginning of creation? Were man and woman created at the same time, or were they created at two separate times? But one of the things that was is really difficult in that comparison is looking at the creation of the animals, because clearly in Genesis 1, animals are created and then mankind is created last. But in Genesis 2, man is created and then he's placed in the garden, and then the animals are created and brought before him, and they're brought before him for a purpose. They're for him to find this like helper. Right, this helper that's sort of suited to him, and of course, when they don't suit him, then God creates woman.
Right.
But it's interesting to read through some of the commentaries on Genesis and how they try to wrestle with this. And ideas like Victor Hamilton in his Genesis commentary has a comment, and I'll paraphrase it, but it's something like, "Well, this isn't, it's not really a problem because God created all the animals in Genesis 1, but then he created new animals for the garden." And it's like, okay, I mean, is that possible? I mean, I don't think so, because it says things in the Hebrew. It's like, and he created all the animals and all the birds of the sky. And it's like, that's language of initial creation. But I mean, okay, maybe you mean all the birds of the sky for the garden. But I mean, if you have to go there, it's sort of, it's problematic.
And suddenly it doesn't become as accessible. And isn't the whole point of this book is that it's supposed to be the guideline to life and everything, right? What's the point if you have to look up certain translations and certain other things in order to get the truth of the message? And I understand that's not how the Hebrew people necessarily understood at least their books, right? But that's the Christian idea, right? That's the idea of at least a popular evangelical idea, that this is a book, this is your guide to life, and it's going to tell you all the answers, but you have to get the right interpretation with the right translations and the right commentaries. Otherwise, you're going to be completely lost. And like even now, so I have like a copy of the Skeptic's annotated Bible here, right? It's fun. I recommend people get one just to look at it if you're not even interested in reading the Bible. That's a fun way to look through it. But even then, I'm like, I'm not even sure if some of these things because what it does is it points out some of the like kind of ridiculous stuff in the Bible, but it also talks about like some contradictions and stuff. I'm not fully convinced that at least a quarter of those, if not half, are probably not even actually contradictions. I think it's probably just a misunderstanding of the original text and stuff of these languages. And I see that as a problem in the atheist community. I think sometimes we kind of pull contradictions out there. But even then, it's like, well, we can't even be sure because we don't know, because we don't even have a lot of the original text for this stuff. And these are copies on copies on copies. I mean, there's just so many problems when you look at treating this book as the be all end all,
Yeah. I mean, I think, Joel Baden is a biblical scholar out at Yale, brilliant guy, and he wrote a book, 2012 publication called The Composition of the Pentateuch. And I recommend everybody get it. It's he's just a great guy and a
Mm.
brilliant scholar. But he opens up his book with an analysis of Genesis 37 and the Joseph story that everybody's familiar with. And the question that he asks is, how did Joseph get to Egypt? If you remember the story, Joseph has this dream and he tells it to his brothers and to his father and mother, and they're all supposed to worship him in this dream, and they all get really pissed at him. And he goes out to visit his brothers out, tending the sheep, and the brothers plot to kill him, but then they end up throwing him in a pit. And then ultimately he gets sold to this, these traveling merchants, and they take him down to Egypt and sell him into slavery to Potiphar. Well, the problem is if you read the text closely, and he has a brilliant analysis of this, and you ask yourself, how did he get there? It's really hard to answer, because the text lays out that they plot to kill him, but then they see that this Ishmaelite caravan coming by, and they decide, let's not do that. Let's sell him to the Ishmaelites.